thank you so much for coming to this, because not only are you enjoying a good dinner and hearing from Dr. Craig, but you're also helping to support the Christian Apologetics program at Biola, and we're very grateful for that. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and I think you'll enjoy the talk tonight. Well, you can see that it's objections so bad I couldn't have made them up. This is going to be a little bit of fun. In fact, it kept me thinking about a comment I heard from William F. Buckley one time on Firing Line. His opponent was making just a terrible argument. And Buckley looked at him and said, I don't mean to insult your intelligence by suggesting that you actually believe what you just said, So I think you'll have that in mind when you hear some of this. Well, the reason you're here is because you actually know who Dr. Craig is, so I don't know that I need to give a long introduction. As you know, he's got a doctorate in philosophy and a doctorate in New Testament studies, and he's got a whole range of books. There's a bio on the blue sheet in front of you, but be aware he does have a brand new book out called On Guard, which is a wonderful, popular treatment of apologetics that's being gobbled up by churches all around the country, and there's a wonderful study guide that accompanies it, and people are going through the study, and we're just thrilled that Dr. Craig was able to boil down some of his high-level thinking to a popular level so that we can all, have at it. Well, without further ado, Dr. Craig, look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have been looking forward to this evening and am just delighted to have the opportunity to share this talk with you tonight, which I've never given before. So this is its inaugural flight, so to speak, and I'm delighted to have the chance to share it with you. And I just want to second what Craig said about the value of this apologetics program at Biola. I was at those sessions this morning in Sacramento listening to these graduates from the Biola program, and I have to tell you, honestly, I was so impressed. It was the best, I think, testimony, the best advertising that you could possibly have for the value of this program, to see what its graduates can do. They were obviously well-trained and well-equipped to give a reason for the hope within, and I was so impressed with them, and I consider it a privilege to be partnered with the team here at Biola in this apologetics program. Well, in my published work on the cosmological argument, I always try to anticipate and respond to objections that might be raised against the argument, so that readers might be equipped to deal with them should someone bring them up in conversation. And I figured that I had basically dealt with virtually all of the objections that critics might raise, and that any further debate would be over the adequacy of my responses. Alas, however, I discovered that I've been unsuccessful in covering all the bases. For what I've come to realize is that some objections are so squirrely, so off the wall, so bad, that I could never have anticipated them. These criticisms are not found in scholarly journals. Instead, they're found in popular critiques of the argument on the internet and YouTube. Up to now, I've focused on scholarly critiques of the argument and just ignored such popular criticisms because I figured they were so misguided that there just was no point in responding to them. But tonight, I've chosen to use this opportunity to address the worst of them. Now, you might be thinking, well, if these objections are really that bad, then why waste time responding to them? Well, there are several reasons, I think, for doing so. First, these objections are very widespread and therefore very influential. Infidel websites and YouTube are replete with these criticisms. They reach thousands of people, and they are confidently touted by many as delivering crushing refutations of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Secondly, the average layman, not being trained in philosophy or logic, may not know how to answer these objections. I frequently receive emails from visitors to our website, reasonablefaith.org, including a link to some video or some website, and asking for help in dealing with these objections. People are unable to discern where the fallacy lies, and therefore they often find themselves at a loss for words when confronting these objections in conversation. Or they may even find these criticisms to be fairly persuasive. And finally, number 3, answering these objections usually yields some positive insight, which is valuable. We can, for example, clarify and so come to a better understanding of certain fallacies which are alleged against the argument, or gain a deeper insight into a certain concept that plays a role in the argument. So I think that the time taken to answer these objections will be time well spent and will repay itself. Now, I had thought at first tonight to arrange our world's worst objections into a sort of top 10 list, climaxing with the all-time worst of the worst. But the problem is that the worst of the worst is not necessarily the most entertaining, so that our list would reach something of an anticlimax. So, rather than arrange the objections in this way, I decided instead to arrange them according to the steps in the argument, grouping together first objections to the general form of the argument, followed secondly by objections to each of the 2 premises, respectively, and then finally wrapping up with objections to the argument's conclusion. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the Kalam Cosmological Argument, I'll first provide a brief summary of it. The argument is a simple syllogism. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. The crucial second premise of the argument is supported by both philosophical arguments against the infinitude of the past and by scientific evidence for a beginning of the universe. Having arrived at the conclusion that the universe has a cause, one may then do a conceptual analysis of what it means to be a cause of the universe. And one discovers that one is thereby brought to an uncaused, beginningless, changeless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. For the intriguing details, have a look at On Guard or Reasonable Faith. Now, with this summary of the argument in mind, let's go to our objections. First, we want to consider objections to the form of the argument. So, objection number 1. Craig says that he believes in God on the basis of the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit in his heart, not on the basis of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. In fact, he says that even if the argument were refuted, he would still believe in God. This is blatant hypocrisy on Craig's part. Response to objection number 1. The problem with this objection is that even if I were a hypocrite, there's just no relationship between the soundness of an argument and the psychological state of the person propounding it. The objector is thus guilty of putting forth a textbook example of an argument ad hominem, that is to say, trying to invalidate a position by attacking the character of the person who defends it. So, what does make for a sound deductive argument? The answer is true premises and valid logic. True premises and valid logic. An argument is sound if the premises of the argument are true and the conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic. The soundness of the Kalam Cosmological Argument is thus entirely independent of me. The argument was, after all, defended by the medieval Muslim theologian Al-Ghazali 1,000 years before I was born. If the argument is sound, it was sound then. If the argument is sound, it was sound during the Jurassic period, before anyone had propounded it. My alleged hypocrisy just has nothing to do with the soundness of the argument. Now, to be a good argument, the argument must admittedly be more than merely sound. If the premises of an argument are true, but we have no evidence for the truth of those premises, then the argument will not be a good one. It may, unbeknownst to us, be sound, but in the absence of any evidence for the premises, it won't, or at least shouldn't, convince anyone. The premises have to have some kind of epistemic warrant for us in order for a sound argument to be a good argument. Now, I've argued that what is needed is that the premises need to be not only true, but more plausible than their opposites, or negations. If it is more plausible that a premise is true in light of the evidence rather than false, then we ought to believe the premise. Now, plausibility is, to a certain degree, person-relative. Some people may find a premise more plausible than its opposite, while others may not. In that sense, the goodness of an argument is not wholly independent of people's psychological states. In the case of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, I do, in fact, find the premises more plausible than their opposites, and therefore I'm convinced that it is a good argument. I just don't regard the argument as the basis for my belief in God. And I've been quite candid about that. My belief in God is a properly basic belief grounded in the inner witness of God's Holy Spirit. And I find it odd that rather than being commended for my candor, I'm accused of hypocrisy. I've elsewhere defended the proper basicality of belief in God on the basis of the Spirit's witness, but that's quite unnecessary here, for even if I were entirely mistaken about that, it would have no bearing on the worth of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. To illustrate the point, suppose I believe that Abraham Lincoln was one of the greatest of the American presidents. And in order to convince you of this, I present to you the testimony of expert historians, along with a detailed account of Lincoln's amazing accomplishments. But suppose that the real reason that I think Lincoln was so great is because he had a beard. And I once had a beard, and therefore am prejudiced in favor of bearded presidents. Obviously, my personal prejudice would have no bearing whatsoever upon the worth of the evidence for Lincoln's greatness. Similarly, whatever reason I have personally for believing in God, whether it's the witness of the Holy Spirit, or the ontological argument, or the teleological argument, or divine revelation, or whatever, that just has no relation to the soundness or the worth of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The skeptic may not like my taking belief in God as properly basic, but that's not a criticism of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. That's at best a rejection of proper basicality of belief in God, which has simply no bearing on the worth of the Kalam argument. Bad objection number 2. The Kalam Cosmological Argument is question-begging, for the truth of the first premise presupposes the truth of the conclusion. Therefore, the argument is an example of reasoning in a circle. Response to number 2. All the objector has done is describe the nature of a deductive argument. In a deductive argument, the conclusion is implicit in the premises, waiting to be derived by the logical rules of inference. A classic illustration of a deductive argument is the following. 1. all men are mortal. 2, Socrates is a man. 3, therefore, Socrates is mortal. This argument has the same logical form as the Kalam Cosmological Argument. In fact, this form of the argument even has a name. It's called modus ponens. Symbolically, it looks like this. P implies Q, P, therefore, Q. This is one of the most basic and important, logically valid argument forms. Incredibly, however, I have actually seen claims by internet critics that this argument about Socrates being mortal is also question-begging. Now, this raises the question of what it means for an argument to be question-begging. Technically, arguments don't beg the question. People do. One is guilty of begging the question if one's only reason for believing in a premise is that one already believes in the conclusion. For example, suppose you were to present the following argument for the existence of God. 1, either God exists or the moon is made of green cheese. 2, the moon is not made of green cheese. 3, therefore, God exists. Now, this is a sound argument for God's existence. Its premises are both true, and the conclusion follows from the premises by the rules of logic, specifically disjunctive syllogism. Nevertheless, the argument is not any good because your only reason for believing the first premise to be true is that you already believe that God exists. A disjunction like premise 1 is true if one of the disjuncts is true. But the belief that God exists is the conclusion of the argument. Therefore, in putting forward this argument, you are reasoning in a circle or begging the question. The only reason you believe 1 is because you already believe 3. Now, neither the argument for Socrates' mortality nor the Kalam cosmological argument is like this. In both cases, reasons are given for believing the premise, which are quite independent of the argument's conclusion. Biological and medical evidence may be marshaled on behalf of the premise that all men are mortal. And I've presented arguments, which I'll review shortly, for the truth of the premise that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Therefore, I have not begged the question. The objector has made an elementary mistake of confusing a deductive argument with a question-begging argument. Bad objection number 3. The argument commits the fallacy of equivocation. In the first premise, cause means material cause, while in the conclusion, it does not. Response to objection number 3. This objection raises the question of what it means to commit the fallacy of equivocation. This fallacy is using a word in the same context with 2 different meanings. For example, suppose someone were to reason as follows. 1, Socrates was Greek. 2, Greek is a language. 3, therefore Socrates is a language. The untoward conclusion results from equivocating on the meaning of the word Greek, using it first to denote an ethnicity or nationality, and then later a language. Now, in formulating the Kalam cosmological argument, I intended to speak of what Aristotle called efficient causes. Aristotle distinguished between efficient causes and material causes. An efficient cause is what brings an effect into being, what produces an effect in existence, while a material cause is the stuff out of which the thing is made. So, for example, Michelangelo was the efficient cause of the statue David. and the material cause of David was the block of marble that Michelangelo sculpted. My claim was that whatever begins to exist has an efficient cause, and therefore the universe, having begun to exist, must have an efficient cause. The charge of equivocation immediately evaporates. These first three objections to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, while not very scintillating, are among the very worst objections. Without challenging the truth of any of its premises, they attack what is a logically impeccable argument. Let's go then to objections to the first premise. Bad objection number 4. The first premise is based upon the fallacy of composition. It fallaciously infers that because everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the whole universe has a cause. Response to number 4. In order to understand this objection, we need to understand the fallacy of composition. This is the fallacy of reasoning that because every part of a thing has a certain property, therefore the whole thing has that same property. Now, while wholes do sometimes possess the properties of their parts, for example, a fence, every picket of which is green, is also green, this is not always the case. For example, every little part of an elephant may be light in weight, but that does not imply that the whole elephant is light in weight. Now, I have never argued that because every part of the universe has a cause, therefore the whole universe has a cause. That would be manifestly fallacious. Rather, the reasons I've offered for thinking that everything that begins to exist has a cause are these. Number 1, something cannot come from nothing. To claim that something can come into being out of nothing is worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. But if you deny premise 1, you've got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever. But nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause. 2, if something can come into being from nothing, it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't come into being from nothing. Think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer come into being out of nothing? Why is it only universes that can pop into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? There can't be anything about nothingness that favors universes, for nothingness doesn't have any properties, nor can anything constrain nothingness, since there isn't anything to be constrained. Number 3, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. Premise 1 is constantly verified and never falsified. It's hard to understand how any atheist committed to modern science could deny that premise 1 is more plausibly true than false in light of the evidence. Now, note well that the third reason is an appeal to inductive reasoning, not reasoning by composition. It's drawing an inductive inference about all the members of a class of things based on a sample of the class. Inductive reasoning undergirds all of science and is not to be confused with reasoning by composition, which is a fallacy. So this objection is simply aimed at a straw man of the objector's own construction. Bad objection number 5. If the universe began to exist, then it must have come from nothing. That is quite plausible, since there are no constraints on nothing. And so nothing can do anything, including producing the universe. This objector seems to be hopelessly confused about the use of the word nothing, when it is rightly said that nothing preceded the universe. One doesn't mean that something preceded it and that was nothing. We mean that it was not preceded by anything. Reifying negative terms has been the butt of jokes as old as Homer's story of the Cyclops and Odysseus. Just imagine, if you will, the following dialogue between two people discussing the Second World War. Nothing stopped the German advance from sweeping across Belgium. Oh, well, that's good. I'm glad it was stopped. But it wasn't stopped. But you said nothing stopped it. Well, that's right. Nothing stopped it. Well, that's what I said. It was stopped, and it was nothing that stopped it. No, I meant that it wasn't stopped by anything. Well, then why didn't you say so in the first place? The objector, in thinking that nothing produced the universe, seems to be guilty of exactly the same sort of mistake. Nothingness has no properties, no powers. It isn't even anything. And therefore, it is wholly misconceived to say that it produced the universe. To say that the universe was caused by nothing is to say that the universe had no cause. It wasn't caused by anything. That is surely metaphysically absurd. Out of nothing, nothing comes. This is a classical principle of metaphysics that goes back to at least Plato. In his classic dialogue, the Timaeus, Plato wrote the following: "We must, in my opinion, begin by distinguishing between that which always is and never becomes from that which is always becoming and never is. Everything that becomes or changes must do so owing to some cause, for nothing can come to be without a cause. As for the world, call it that, or cosmos, or any other name acceptable to it, we must ask about it the question one is bound to ask to begin with about anything, whether it has always existed and had no beginning, or whether it has come into existence and started from some beginning. The answer is that it has come into being, and what comes into being or changes must do so, we said, owing to some cause." And thus the first premise of the Kalam Cosmological Argument is one of the oldest and most widely recognized truths of metaphysics. Consider now then objections to the second premise, that the universe began to exist. Objection number 6: nothing ever begins to exist, for the material of which a thing consists precedes it. So it is not true that the universe began to exist. Response to number 6. I think this is my favorite bad objection, since the assertion that nothing ever begins to exist is so patently ridiculous. Did I exist before I was conceived? If so, where was I? What was I doing during the Jurassic period? Has the World Trade Center always existed? If so, why didn't the Native American Indians notice it? This objection obviously confuses a thing with the matter or stuff of which the thing is made. Just because the stuff of which something was made has always existed doesn't imply that the thing itself has always existed. Now, since writing this talk, it has occurred to me that the objector could save himself from the embarrassment of affirming that he has always existed by adopting what's called mereological nihilism, which is the view that there are no composite objects. That is to say, all that exists are just fundamental particles which are arranged in various ways. So in fact, there really are no chairs or tables or horses or people or palm trees. There are just fundamental particles which are arranged chair-wise or table-wise or people-wise. And so in denying that he ever began to exist, the objector isn't affirming that he's always existed. Rather, what he's denying is that he ever does exist. So in this case, the cure is really worse than the disease, because now instead of saying he has always existed, what the objector has to say is that he doesn't exist. The objector literally does not exist. Now, if that's the case, then it might make us wonder why we should bother responding to him if he doesn't exist. What this implies is that, in fact, nobody, literally nobody, has ever raised this objection, because there aren't any people. But this is surely absurd. Am I to believe, am I to affirm that I do not exist? It reminds me of the undergraduate student who had been reading Descartes and burst into his professor's office early one morning, bleary-eyed and unshaven. Obviously, he had been up all night. He was very distraught, and he said, "Professor, tell me, do I exist?" And the professor looked at him and said, "Who wants to know?" The idea that one does not exist is surely metaphysically absurd. So that it seems to me that this is simply to jump out of the frying pan into the fire. Well, the serious point of this muddled objection, I think, is its presupposition that everything that begins has a material cause. But that claim is irrelevant to the truth of the two premises of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and it would require proof in any case. Now, it is true, I think, that in our experience, material things do not begin to exist without material causes. So we do have the same sort of inductive evidence on behalf of material causation as we have for efficient causation. But if we have good arguments and evidence that the material realm had an absolute beginning preceded by nothing, this can override the inductive evidence. What we cannot reasonably say, I think, is that the universe sprang into being without either an efficient or a material cause, since being does not come from non-being. But there's no sort of metaphysical absurdity involved in something's having an efficient cause, but no material cause. Objection number 7. The argument equivocates on begins to exist. In premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. It means begin from a previous material state. But in 2, the universe began to exist. It means not from a material state. Answer to number 7. In order to defeat the allegation of equivocation, all one needs to do is to provide a univocal meaning for the phrase in both of its occurrences. And that's easy to do. By begins to exist, all I mean is comes into being. Everything that comes into being has a cause, and the universe came into being. No equivocation here. Now, if we want to, we can go still further and provide an analysis of what it means to begin to exist. Here is one such analysis. X begins to exist if and only if X exists at some time t, and there is no time t star prior to t at which X exists. This analysis is adequate for all practical purposes. It would allow even time itself to begin to exist. It would become problematic only in case one thinks that God is timeless without creation and enters time at the moment of creation. In such a case, God would exist at the first moment of time, t0, and there would be no time, t star, prior to t0, at which God existed. It would follow then from our analysis that God began to exist at t0, which is wrong-headed, since God did not come into being at t0. Fortunately, this problem is easily fixed by amending our analysis as follows. X begins to exist if and only if X exists at some time, and there is no time t star prior to t at which X exists, and no state of affairs in the actual world in which X exists timelessly. So amended, the analysis does not imply that God began to exist at the first moment of time if he enters into time from a state of timelessness at the moment of creation. In sum, the objections to the second premise are just as bad as the objections to the first. The second premise is certainly a controversial premise, and it's open to debate, but not for the reasons alleged here. Finally, arguments or objections to the argument's conclusion. Objection number 8. The argument is logically self-contradictory, for it says that everything has a cause, yet it concludes that there is a first uncaused cause. Response to number 8. Man, how do people think these things up? Premise number 1 states that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being without a cause. The premise does not require that something that is eternal and never had a beginning has a cause. Think again of Plato's distinction between that which always is and that which comes into being. The objector has been inattentive to the formulation of the first premise. Notice that this is not special pleading for God. The atheist has typically said that the universe itself is eternal and uncaused. Matter and energy have existed from eternity past and so have no cause of their being. The problem is that supposition has now been rendered dubious in light of the strong arguments in support of premise 2 that the universe began to exist. Objection number 9. The cause mentioned in the argument's conclusion is not different from nothing. For timelessness, changelessness, spacelessness, etc., are all purely negative attributions, which are also true of nothingness. Thus, the argument might as well be taken to prove that the universe came into being from nothing. Response to number 9. You've got to be kidding. The argument concludes to a cause of the universe. That is a positive existential affirmation. There is a cause of the universe. To say that the universe was caused by nothing, by contrast, is to affirm that it was not caused by anything. In other words, that the universe is uncaused, which is the very opposite of the argument's conclusion. Moreover, the argument's conclusion also implies the attribution of incredible causal power to this entity that brought the universe into being without any sort of material cause. It is therefore wholly different from nothing, which has no reality, no properties, and no causal powers. Finally, the attribution of negative predicates like timelessness, changelessness, spacelessness, and so on to this entity is enormously informative and metaphysically significant. From its timelessness and immateriality, I've argued that we can deduce its personhood. This is a positive property of great significance and theological importance and utterly unlike nothingness. Finally, objection number 10. Our 10th and final bad objection comes courtesy of that enfant terrible of the new atheism, Richard Dawkins. He doesn't dispute either premise of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Instead, he just complains about the argument's conclusion. He writes, even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name, there is absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. Response to number 10. Apart from the opening dig, this is an amazingly concessionary statement. Dawkins doesn't deny that the argument successfully demonstrates the existence of an uncaused, beginningless, changeless, immaterial, spaceless, timeless, and unimaginably powerful personal creator of the universe. He merely complains that this cause hasn't also been shown to be omnipotent, omniscient, good, creative of design, listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. So what? The argument doesn't aspire to prove those things. It would be a bizarre form of atheism, indeed one not worth the name, that conceded that there exists an uncaused, beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and unimaginably powerful personal creator of the universe, who may, for all we know, also possess all the properties listed by Dawkins. Now, we needn't call the personal creator of the universe God if Dawkins finds this unhelpful or misleading, but the point remains that a being such as described must exist. So, there you have them, the world's 10 all-time worst. These represent the level of discourse that pervades the internet and YouTube. I think you can see how worthless they are. Now, I hope you don't feel that I've wasted your time this evening. For in discussing these bad objections, I hope that you've gained a better understanding of the sort of fallacies which are alleged against the argument, along with some deeper insight into the argument itself. Then, Clay, you pick whomever you want to be on the mic. And
well, we'll start right here.
Okay.
Would you say that the Big Bang proves the Kalam Cosmological Argument?
Would I say the Big Bang proves the Kalam Cosmological Argument? I would say that the Big Bang is evidence for the second premise of the argument. And I think it's important to be careful in stating it that way, because often you'll get accused of a God of the gaps sort of reasoning. But I'm not using the Big Bang to prove God. I'm using the Big Bang to prove the second premise, that the universe began to exist, which is a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy or astrophysics. So the way I would present the scientific evidence is that scientific evidence can support a premise in an argument for a conclusion having religious significance.
Yes, Dr. Craig. These academic objections are fairly recent, I guess. Before, you didn't really want to dignify them with a response, pretty much, but now you find yourself having to respond to these type of objections. Do you think that the culture in the last 30 years has dumbed down to the point where they're making these kind of arguments?
That's a really hard judgment to make. Although I think these are very bad arguments, at least there is this kind of debate going on. And I'm not aware that, say, back in the 50s or even the 60s, that these sorts of debates were taking place. So while these are kind of low level, at least there is this interaction, this roiling, bubbling cauldron of discussion. So I'm not sure it's a dumbing down, frankly. I think the culture has always been kind of dumb. I see it in a sense as the culture is getting more interested in these things. So I really see it as a positive thing. It's just that we need to help a lot of these infidel types to realize that they haven't mastered the literature, they don't know the scholarly work, and that their objections are pseudo-intellectual. I mean, it sounds intellectual, doesn't it? The fallacy of composition, the fallacy of equivocation, begging the question. These sound like they're really academic intellectual arguments, but it's really pseudo-intellectual misunderstandings if you really understand what those fallacies are. Yes?
Yes, Dr. Craig, how would you answer the objection that the cause could be another universe, like in the multi-universe string theory?
Mm-hmm. On two levels, I think you can answer that. Philosophically, the philosophical arguments against an infinite regress apply to any series of events, whether they're in this universe or a sort of embedding multiverse or whatever. If there can't be an actually infinite number of past events, there has to go back to an absolute beginning. So philosophically, the metaphysical arguments just aren't affected by the size of the universe. Now, in terms of the scientific evidence, this is all in the discussion. I mean, multiverse models, higher dimensional models, brain cosmologies, inflationary cosmologies. This isn't foreign to the discussion. This is all part of the discussion. And in my published work, I interact with these multiverse models and try to show how they're empirically inadequate or untenable or imply the very beginning that they were meant to avoid. A very significant development was the discovery in 2003 by Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin of a theorem which proves that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion cannot be infinite in the past. And their theorem applies to the multiverse as well as to our universe. So that even if there is a multiverse, it can't be infinite in the past and must have had a beginning. So if you look at the work that I've done with James Sinclair, for example, in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, you'll find a thorough discussion of all of these higher dimensional and multiverse cosmologies.
Hello, Dr. Craig. On various places in your website, Reasonable Faith, you bring up the and versus the tenseless theory of time. And you mentioned that were one to adopt a B theory, that would constitute a defeater of the first premise of the Kalam as you defend it because it presupposes an A theory. And on a B theory, things don't actually come into being.
That's right.
But I did wonder if one were a B theorist, if you would pretend, I guess, to be a B theorist for a moment, could you formulate a defensible version of the Kalam, for example? Could you say every event has a cause, the beginning of the universe was an event, so therefore the universe has a cause?
Well, I guess I wouldn't see on a... Now, let's clarify this for those who aren't familiar with the terminology. There are two broad theories of time. One is what we might call the A theory, which is a dynamic theory of time, that things come into being and then go out of being, that temporal becoming is real. The other theory is called the B theory, which is a sort of static theory, and says that events in the past, the present, and the future are all equally real. Time is like a line stretched out, and temporal becoming is just an illusion of human consciousness. It's just our subjective location on the timeline. But in fact, there is no real present, no real now. Time is space-like, if you will. And what he suggested is that, on my view, if time is like the B theory, then I don't see any reason to think that the beginning of the universe would require a cause, because the universe never really comes into being. The universe as a whole, the four-dimensional space-time block, just exists timelessly. And to say it has a beginning just means the block has a front edge. And I can't see any reason to think that in virtue of having a front edge, it needs a cause. And I would say the same if you do it in terms of event causation. Why would you need a cause for that first event on a B theory? So that's why I have spent an enormous amount of time in discussing the differences between the A and the B theory and giving a very robust metaphysical defense of the A theory of time, because I do think this is the truth. I think my commitment to the reality of temporal becoming is probably second philosophically only to my belief in God. I just can't imagine anything that could be more evident than the reality of the passage of time and the reality of the present. So if there's somebody who can make the Kalam argument work on a B theory, boy, all the more power to him. I say go to it. But for my hunch, I don't see that it works if you're a B theory. I think instead what you'll do is appeal to the Leibnizian version of the cosmological argument, namely, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does this contingent, four-dimensional, space-time thing exist rather than nothing? And I think that will lead you then, via Leibniz's reasoning, to God as a metaphysically necessary, sufficient reason for the existence of this space-time block.
Hello, Dr. Craig. Thanks for coming out. Really appreciate it. So do you want me to hold this? All right, cool. I've watched a lot of the debates that you've done and a lot of the lectures that you've given over the years on YouTube and various other places. And I've really yet to see anyone come up with any good arguments against the existence of God by the standards that you argue and the way that you formulate your arguments and the objections that they come up with. So I was wondering, in your opinion, what would be the best objections that you've come across to this argument, and what would be the rebuttals that you?
Well, I think the best objections would be probably arguments from the appearance of gratuitous evil and suffering in the world. That's very powerful emotionally, and I think we all have difficulty when we see something like a little child suffer horribly an apparently gratuitous death. And what I would simply say is what I've said in my books like Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, that it's neither inconsistent with God's existence nor does it render God's existence improbable to see those sorts of events, because God could have morally sufficient reasons for those which we do not discern within our lifetime and our limited sphere of knowledge. And I think it's not at all improbable that only in a world that is suffused with natural and moral evil would the maximal number of people freely come to find Him and His salvation, and so eternal life. So that God permits all this evil and suffering only with a view toward maximizing the number of people in the kingdom of God. The other objection would be probably arguments based on the impossibility of mind-body interaction. And these would be your traditional monistic arguments against dualism. How can the mind influence the body? How can an immaterial substance have effects in the material body? And that, writ large, would be, how can God have effects upon the world? And there really isn't an answer to that in one sense, because the dualist doesn't claim that there's any sort of intermediate linkage between the mind and the body, or between God and the world, that it's a direct action. And what I would appeal to there, I suppose, would be simply to say that we have good reasons for believing that dualism is true about ourselves, that we are immaterial selves or substances endowed with intentionality and free will, and that we experience by acquaintance our ability to cause effects in our body and in the world. And although we do not understand how this happens, we know it happens. And that therefore that's enough to say that it's also possible for God, as an immaterial self, to have direct effects in the world which would be analogous to direct actions that we would have in our body.
I noticed that there were two objections of equivocation that you discussed, and I'm going to try a third out on you and see what you say.
Okay.
I believe that Paul Draper alleged that in the first premise of the Kalam argument, it's actually anything that begins to exist within time has a cause. And premise 2 is that the universe began to exist with time. And that we've never actually seen anything begin to exist with time like the standard model is saying that the universe did. And so he's saying we really don't have any reason to say that it's more likely that the universe, which began with time instead of within time, actually did so. I was just interested.
Yes, that's not really an argument that alleges I'm equivocating. I think really what that is just an argument against the truth of the first premise, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. He's saying that that premise is true with respect to things in time, but it's not true of the universe which originates with time. And I think that that is simply a distinction without a difference, that the first premise is based, as Plato saw, in this metaphysical intuition that being cannot come from non-being. And it's just immaterial whether the thing that comes into being was preceded by a time in which it didn't exist. How could that even be relevant to its coming into being or not. In fact, it would seem like it would be more difficult for something to come into being out of nothing if there wasn't anything prior to it. And on an A theory of time, in which temporal becoming is real, every moment of time is in a sense like a fresh beginning, because the past is gone. There isn't anything prior to it. So I can't see that there's any metaphysical difference of any consequence between something coming into being from nothing in time and something coming into being at the first moment of time. In either case, something can't come from nothing. What he's asking us to believe is that the universe can just pop into being out of nothing. And I think the three arguments that I gave would all apply to that. It is worse than magic. If that is the case, then why is it just universes that pop into being at the beginning of time? Why wasn't it Beethoven or something? And then the third one, this is always verified, never falsified. I suppose that wouldn't apply, because he would say, well, we don't have anything at the beginning of time. So perhaps that would undercut the inductive argument to a degree, I guess. But it wouldn't affect the other two, the metaphysical arguments.
We have one more.
Okay, who has a real burning question for the last question?
I believe it was objection number 6, talking about the things don't actually come into existence.
Yes.
And you had given the possibility of the mereological
Nihilism.
But is that really even, according to the quote you gave by Plato, is that even possible? Because it speaks of changing and alteration as well, needing a cause. And so even if it's just an arrangement of particles, those particles still change to different arrangements. And so
yes,
would they have to avoid it, would they have to devolve all the way to a sort of pantheism where there actually is no distinction in any kind of entity?
Well, this is a very good question, and I was ad-libbing at that point in my lecture this evening, and I had intended to say a further comment, but I neglected because I didn't have notes. And that is, we can actually reformulate or rephrase the Kalam argument to meet the scruples of the mereological nihilist, and it would go like this. If fundamental particles arranged universe-wise begin to exist, they have a cause. Premise 2, the fundamental particles arranged universe-wise began to exist. 3, therefore, the fundamental particles arranged universe-wise have a cause. So you can simply reformulate the argument to meet the demands of the mereological nihilist, whose view in any case I think is absolutely mad. As I say, I at least exist, even if nothing else does. But we can rephrase the argument in such a way as to not assume that the universe is a composite object. Well, thank you very much for coming and sharing this time this evening.